Dr. Robin Ramcharan from Asia Center, Thailand. He will be speaking on the role of ASEAN in Rohingya refugee crisis. Dr. Ramcharan, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, dear friends, I'm Robin Ramcharan. As the chair just said, I'm from Asia Center in Bangkok. We are a think tank that does research, evidence-based research on regional human rights issues. Impact of UN mechanisms, national human rights institutions, and in line with this conference, I should mention we will also have a conference in August of this year on the Rohingya crisis, looking at the multidimensional aspects of the great tragedy. Before I proceed to my key points, I do wish to thank the organizers for inviting me and for their kind support and getting me here to Dhaka. With that said, let me outline my 6 major observations or points, key points. One is, the first is the following. How do I approach this topic of ASEAN's role? Where did I start? I started with the idea of what's ASEAN's responsibility, right, in this whole crisis. And so I think role as a term is fine. I have no problem with that. But let's just think about responsibility for a second. And let's be clear that the primary responsibility for this lies on the state of Myanmar. But then, coming from a political science perspective, how do other actors impact, and in that sense, what is their responsibility? So in the case of ASEAN, I'm thinking of 3 specific elements. One is, my talk is premised on the idea that power matters in international relations, and that the exercise of power or the signaling of power matters. So that's one observation, and ASEAN could do that. Secondly, regional organizations like international organizations do have the capacity to effect change positively in situations like these. There are examples both in interstate and intrastate conflicts where international organizations, regional organizations have made a difference in either preventing or calming, stopping the outbreak of ongoing violence or the outbreak of violence. And 3, I am coming at this with a third thing in mind, which is the adopted norms of ASEAN in recent times. I'll come back to that, the rights norms. So that was my first broad set of observations. The second broad observation is that there have been numerous calls by international NGOs in particular on ASEAN to do something. And so I just want to reiterate some of the elements of those calls, the major points. I'm thinking of Amnesty International, ASEAN Human Rights, Parliamentarians for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, and so on. They've called for an end to the violence, ensure access to all humanitarian agencies, regional, international, ensure voluntary return of Rohingya refugees to Myanmar in safe conditions, address the root causes of the crisis, such as entrenched discrimination, support the fact-finding mission of the UN, Human Rights Council, impose comprehensive arms embargo in Myanmar, and so on. So I just wanted to recall, as we are assessing ASEAN's responsibility, the calls made by the international community of a very serious, credible international entities, organizations. Third, what has been ASEAN's response? Well, I should say it's been problematic, I think. And we may recall 2 things. One is the treatment of the persons heading towards, back in 2015, towards ASEAN shores, the deaths at sea in some cases, and the refouling in some cases, to great objection of the international community. That's one. Of course, we have heard, we know that ASEAN countries, some have taken many Rohingya people and given them protection. But even that is problematic because many of them are not party to the refugee conventions, notably Thailand, Malaysia. And I would note on that score that just now, I think the Malaysian authorities have intercepted a group of Rohingya people who made it to Malaysian shores, and they have said that they will give them, take care of them, give them the appropriate assistance, and then they will turn them over to the immigration authorities. So that already is something problematic, where presumably they will then be, I don't know, in the case of Thailand, they process them under the immigration rules, and so they are obviously, by definition, illegal. So that's one thing, ASEAN's response to the crisis. So that humanitarian dimension I wanted to note. And the second thing in relation to ASEAN's response is, by and large, the inaction since, especially, well, for a long time, but especially since August of last year. So what has ASEAN done? Just to recall, the timid measures. This is my fourth or fifth point, I forget now. So my fourth major point, the responses have been timid. So they have not been able even to put ASEAN, sorry, the issue, the crisis, on the agenda of ASEAN. That's, at least might have been a good first step. Despite calls for an emergency summit, there hasn't been that kind of response. There was a sideline event at the UN General Assembly in, I think it was in 2017, and there was a chairman's statement. The chairman at that time was the Philippines. But of course, that's already a bit problematic in and of itself. The nature of the statement, condemning the ARSA attacks and so on, but not going far enough to condemn all sides, right, in this attack. And so Malaysia, and I think Indonesia, but in particular Malaysia, I believe, if I've got my facts right, distance itself from that particular statement. And then finally, at the ASEAN-Australia meeting summit recently, last month, what you saw was, yes, the issue came up on the agenda, but from the perspective of securitization, right? So that was the angle that came across, that came out of Australia, securitization. The ASEAN chair, Singapore, noted the problem, the potential for so-called radicalization across the region, the regional impact of the crisis. So that was my fourth set of observations. The timid response. Fifth set, how do we explain this? So one is, of course, everybody knows ASEAN's great vaunted norm of non-interference. That's a core principle of ASEAN, so they do not interfere in each other's affairs. It will be interesting to examine ASEAN's approach to R2P itself, a responsibility to protect, in light of this principle of non-interference. And by the way, I must mention that R2P although it is much talked about, there is great disagreement on R2P. I think we all know that. It is not yet a law. It may be an emerging norm, but it is still open for debate. What did the President of the General Assembly do when it was introduced into the General Assembly? The President said, I put it on the agenda, but now I put on my country's hat and I oppose it, right? So just to bring that little anecdote into discussions of R2P. Much of the world, frankly, is still attached to the non-interference principle. There is the famous ASEAN way, and for those who speak Malay, forgive me, I don't, but you may have heard of the term musjawara muafak. Maybe our Malaysian friend can correct my pronunciation. So, which is a kind of a consensual way, non-confrontational way of doing business. Not embarrassing each other, certainly not in public. and ASEAN has held to that quite well. There is the decision-making of ASEAN. There were discussions about going towards a majority decision-making, but they retained the consensual approach. So that, again, doesn't allow for speedy handling of these kinds of crises. Very importantly, there is a lack of normative consensus, I would say, across the region, in particular on human rights norms and values. Yes, ASEAN adopted the ASEAN Charter. Good governance, rule of law, human rights are in the Charter, but each state, it's up to each state to implement and adopt and pursue as they can or are willing to. But I must mention that there was, at the time of the adoption of the Charter, we must be aware that there was a great division inside of ASEAN. There were two camps, essentially the CLMV countries and the others, which by that time you could class as progressives. But the debates in ASEAN, as reported by ASEAN ambassadors and so on who were there, bogged down and were quite contentious, fractious, to the point where they had to be divided into different rooms. And so the ASEAN chair was running from one room to the other. Okay, he said this. Okay, he said that. Okay, he said this. Do you agree? Do you agree? Right? And the ASEAN human rights mechanism and subsequent declarations were compromises, minimum compromises reached. Many argue of course, they're insufficient. They're not protective entities. They are promotional, and it's a promotional entity. But as part of the series of compromises, I come back to the decision-making. They sacrificed the move towards majority decision-making in favor of having a human rights mechanism. But just to tell you the contentious debates that they had over even adopting a human rights mechanism. We know also that there is generally a regression in democracy and rights in the region. So if you have President Duterte, if you have General Prayut in Thailand, maybe it's unreasonable to expect that we will have much movement at the ASEAN level on the Rohingya issue. I should note two more things. One is the economic aspect, and that is the move towards an integrated ASEAN, economic integration, which is proceeding slowly. And in that context, I just take the one example of Thailand, the deepening investment ties between Thailand and Myanmar, and the two are in process of developing an industrial zone that will link up with the Dawei zone, two parts of Gulf of Thailand and Myanmar side. So there are investment, economic relations that are underway. And finally, again, this is all in my fifth point, explaining ASEAN's responses, the timid responses. The geopolitics has been sufficiently mentioned. I would merely highlight the powerful presence of China in the region. And I mentioned the divide between the CLMV and the other countries in relation to human rights. Well, that divide also applies in terms of the influence of China. Very strong in Myanmar, of course, as we all know, but in Cambodia, Laos, and to some extent, Vietnam. And in recent times, we should also see that divide, I'm sorry, one more point, that divide prevented, for example, a unified ASEAN response to China in the China Sea a couple of years ago in Phnom Penh. So that's to tell that's to bring in the geopolitical dimension. Bottom line is, assuming that the rulers of Myanmar are rational beings, rationally calculating all of this, logically calculating, then perhaps there's no better time than to do what they do than the present. especially when you have the world superpower, at least symbolically and maybe practically, I don't want to use the word retreat, but let's say appearing to withdraw, right? So that doesn't help. Then who's left? I had great hopes. I have great hopes for example, India to pick up the slack, for maybe the European Union to do something, maybe Japan to do something, but let's see. So let me end with the sixth set of observations, and that has to do with maybe just some very small recommendations in the spirit of solutions, the title of this event, the approach of this event. One is to call upon the ASEAN states to be better compliant with international refugee standards, and that means adopting the conventions. You know, no treaty. We mentioned some. We heard some difficulties with the refugee convention itself this morning. No treaty is perfect, but at least we have that treaty, and let's at least try to use it in progressive ways. Respect. ASEAN should respect its own normative commitments on human rights. Number two. Number three. It would help greatly, in line with what I've said, if ASEAN were to move to a majority decision-making model. There have been suggestions on certain issues that there could be smaller groups on particular issues with the countries directly affected, for example, to have majority decision-making as subgroups, for example. Let's see how that goes. And finally, you know, if it will help to move along the discussion and inject a sense of urgency to the institution, ASEAN wants to deal with, I mean the leaders of ASEAN, many want to deal with this. It is a problem for them. So what they could do, one mechanism might be, okay, to recognize the linkages between internal political unrest due to rights violations and regional instability. It would be nice if we could address the crises like this, like the one affecting the Rohingya people, the ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes, war crimes, and so on, simply because we are human beings. I think we all can agree to that. But here, coming back to the geopolitics theme, if it takes the securitization of the issue, however problematic it is, to spur action, then I invite you to think, is that something useful? And I will end it there, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak and for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramcharan, and particularly thank you for finishing it within time.